What's up, YouTube? I am the Vanilla Nerd, and today I want to talk more Star Wars. You've seen the thumbnail, read the title, you know what this video is going to be about. I do want to give a spoiler warning though before we begin for the sequel trilogy at large, and a minor spoiler warning for the Star Wars The Clone Wars animated show. I won't be talking about anything too big from that show, but you've been warned. Okay, so many people have asked over the years, and it's a valid question, could a Clone Wars style animated show save the sequel trilogy? And this makes sense. Back in the day, the prequels were not very well loved. I know that there are plenty of anecdotes of people who never hated the prequels, and that's great. But for a lot of us, myself included, they were a lesser trilogy than the original trilogy, and it was really unfortunate. However, George Lucas quickly released Star Wars The Clone Wars just 3 years after Star Wars Episode 3, and The Clone Wars was set in the prequel era. The longer form of storytelling allowed him to dive deep into a lot of the cool and interesting ideas brought up from the prequel trilogy, and as a result, The Clone Wars really made a lot of people fall in love with that time period and era of Star Wars. And I grew up on the prequels and Star Wars The Clone Wars. I learned to love both. I recognize that the prequels weren't as good as the originals. I still think they are lesser than the originals. But watching Star Wars The Clone Wars made me love the prequels and appreciate their inclusion in the saga. To be fair, I always loved the lightsaber fights in the prequel trilogy. They are still top-notch and the best that Star Wars has ever produced. And the fact that they continued to show cool lightsaber fights in Star Wars The Clone Wars just makes it all the better. So the question actually becomes, if the prequels were hated then and the sequels are hated now, could a show like Star Wars The Clone Wars, but made for the sequel trilogy, work? Could it make people fall in love with the sequel trilogy? And the short answer for me is yes. I say this because it's true of virtually all media. Any story that is inspired by another story has the potential to shed a new light on the source material. Classic example is when a movie adapts a book. It happens more often than you think. Lots of movies are adapted from books but don't highlight that fact in the trailers or promotional materials or whatever. But regardless, every time a popular book gets adapted for a big budget movie and all the promotional materials are talking about the author and the source material, what happens? Well, I'll tell you, the book sales for that novel spike. Doesn't matter the format, audiobook, digital copy, paperback, library checkouts, everything increases for that book because people are excited to learn about the source material that inspired this cool movie that's coming out. And honestly, it doesn't matter if you watch the movie first or read the book first. Both get people excited and make them want to consume the other piece of media. And while most people would agree that the book is better than the movie, I know of very few cases where the movie is seen as better than the book, the principle is still true. By making a movie inspired by the book, you garner more interest in the book. The biggest challenge facing books is that they are very long-form media. A good book usually takes 10 to 12 hours to read. Plenty of books take longer, whereas a fun movie is at the most 3 hours long. So even though the book may be better, by making a movie, you're able to reach a wider audience. And even just a small percentage goes back and reads the book, that's still a larger section of people reading that book than there were before. But the differences between books and movies can be a whole own video for another day. The point is that when you make a story inspired by previous stories, regardless of the format, you can increase the interest in both stories. Another example that's a little bit more pertinent to our discussion today is the MCU. In the MCU, you have Avengers movies, and they are inspired by these standalone films of the MCU. It's a great formula. You make a mediocre standalone film that introduces a beloved hero. That hero shows up again in an Avengers movie, and bing, bang, boom, you're making money. I know that there's a hierarchy of Avengers movies. A lot of people don't like Avengers 2. I personally think it's excellent, but that's beside the point. The point is, even Avengers 2 is a higher quality of film than most of the standalone films in the MCU. So when you watch Avengers and you see characters like Thor, Iron Man, and Captain America, it makes you want to go back and rewatch the stories that led up to that movie. Even though Thor 2 and Iron Man 3 aren't that good, you still want to watch them so you know where we last saw Iron Man and Thor. And this also works for Captain America 2, The Winter Soldier. It just so happens that I think Captain America 2 is better than Avengers 2, and ultimately it's one of the best movies Marvel has ever created. But that's something I discuss in this video. Regardless, the metaphor is there. Mediocre standalone films are like the prequel trilogy, where The really solid Star Wars The Clone Wars is like the Avengers movies. One supports the other, and it makes all stories be more rewatchable, and everyone wants to watch those stories and learn more, and it's great. So, yes, a Clone Wars style show made about the sequels could do the same thing as an Avengers movie or a movie adaptation of a book, or as the Clone Wars itself did, and it could garner more interest in the sequel trilogy. Even though those movies are riddled with plot holes and inconsistencies, if done well, a Clone Wars style show for the sequel trilogy could still make me go back and rewatch those films, because I have now fallen in love with that era of Star Wars. But the key here is done well. The secret behind the MCU's success, movie adaptations of books, and the Clone Wars is that all were really good projects. Each Avengers movie was really good. The guys over at Disney made sure to spend extra money, extra time to get those movies just right. The same thing is true of movie adaptations of books. The movies that are good films that do their best to respect the source material, aka the book, are beloved. Lord of the Rings, the new Dune trilogy, and Harry Potter are all great examples. But note that the poorly made movies, the ones that don't respect the source material, are forgotten about and failed to gain new interest in the book. The original Dune movie back in the 1980s is completely forgettable. I'm sure at the time it increased book sales a bit, but ultimately no one likes that movie. I mean, some people might like it for its campy nature, but besides that, no one really likes it. And the same thing is true of like Artemis Fowl movie on Disney+. It was an absolutely terrible movie that completely rejected the source material, and so it did not increase a lot of interest in the Artemis Fowl book series. Again, I'm sure that book sales did go up a little bit during that time, but it wasn't significant. This is to say that an animated show done like Star Wars The Clone Wars, but for the sequel trilogy, could work to save the sequel trilogy, or at least make people appreciate the sequel trilogy, if, and only if, it was very well done. And unless the show is top-notch, I don't think it would work. Part of the problem is because the sequel trilogy is so unloved to begin with. If you have good source material, you have some leeway with the quality of the new material to still be successful. A great example is Harry Potter. The source material is excellent. Those 7 books are still loved today. So it was okay that some of the Harry Potter movies weren't as faithfully adapted as others. I'm looking at you, Harry Potter 4. The point is that because the source material was so loved, we were willing to sit through not the best interpretations in order to get an overall really solid movie franchise, like the Harry Potter series. But the problem with the sequel trilogy is you don't have that leeway here. You don't have that freedom. If you make a bad animated sequel show, then it's just going to add to the growing pile of reasons people hate the sequel trilogy. They'll just say, great, another wasted project that focused on an era of Star Wars no one's interested in, and it'll be a problem and yet another failure stacked on top of this trilogy. So you have to make it good. Let's look at what happens on the other hand when you have bad source material that you're trying to regain interest in. Your new material must be better. It must be excellent in order to gain that newfound interest. Here's where Star Wars The Clone Wars and the prequel trilogy come in. The prequel trilogy was not the greatest source material. It's better than some, but it's not the greatest. The first few seasons of Star Wars The Clone Wars then had to be good, but they were not. They were looked at with derision because frankly the quality just wasn't there. There were some standout episodes in those seasons, don't get me wrong, I will always love Star Wars The Clone Wars, but I'd be lying to you if I believe that Star Wars The Clone Wars could have been as successful as fondly remembered without seasons 3, 4, and 5, where the show really took off. So this fictitious animated sequel trilogy show would have to be good, because the sequel trilogy is even worse source material than the prequel trilogy. But all of that's kind of obvious. Every product should be good. In fact, I think there are a few creators that go into a project thinking, I'm going to make this bad. However, when it comes to Star Wars, a lot of people don't know how to make good Star Wars, which is unfortunate. So let's analyze what are some things about Star Wars The Clone Wars that made it good. First and foremost, Star Wars The Clone Wars was an anthology series. This meant that different arcs followed different characters, and it wasn't necessary to watch every episode of a season to be following along with the current episode's plot and story. Now, I do stand by the arcs that Star Wars The Clone Wars went on. When Star Wars The Clone Wars was really good, they were telling a singular story across 3 or 4 episodes. So to be an anthology, but across arcs, not episode to episode per se. That's how you make a good show. And I think this was key for the Clone Wars because if you didn't like certain characters or certain storylines, great. Tune in next week or in 2 or 3 weeks when a new episode or a new arc has begun. And the same would be true for the sequel trilogy. In a trilogy with divisive characters that people have all sorts of opinions on, it would be very important to switch between characters in case someone didn't like a certain character or a certain storyline. The second thing I want to talk about that made Star Wars The Clone Wars great was the fact that they were not afraid to change characters. And I mean like change their personalities, make them a little different. Case in point, Anakin Skywalker. In the prequel trilogy, Hayden Christensen had some questionable acting. I think he did really well in Star Wars Episode 3 and not so well in Star Wars Episode 2. Not going to get into that right now, but the character of Anakin that they brought to life for the Clone Wars was much better. Dave Filoni described him as a mix between Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. He had all the swagger of Han Solo, but all of the cool Jedi powers of Luke Skywalker. And I love that. It worked so well for his character. It recontextualized Anakin Skywalker into a believable, kind of victim of circumstance and stuff, and a tragic hero. It just worked so well. They even changed a character like Obi-Wan. He honestly wasn't very different from his on-screen personality, but they did give him a love interest, something that was very different from the prim and proper Jedi we knew from the films. Honestly, it was great for his character, and they did it very respectfully, which was key. So, respectfully reinterpreting and changing these characters would be key for the sequel trilogy, especially since that trilogy is full of characters with wasted potential. And the third thing I want to point out that Star Wars The Clone Wars did great was that it expanded the Star Wars universe. Mandalore, Hondo Ohnaka and his pirates, and the Night Sisters are just 3 examples of things that were very new to Star Wars and explored in the Clone Wars. Yes, Mandalore had shown up significantly in the EU, and I think even the Night Sister had been hinted at earlier in the Star Wars mythos, but ultimately many people were introduced to those groups through the Clone Wars. Regardless, there are other examples in the Clone Wars, like the brain worms or other things, but the point is that Star Wars The Clone Wars did well because it expanded the universe. It brought in new and interesting ideas. And this is something that the sequel trilogy is sorely lacking. So let's really focus on the few new ideas they did bring in, like Maz Kanata, or Broom Boy, or the idea of the Knights of Ren. Those are all some storylines I'd like to explore more that were brought up in the sequel trilogy, but not fully explored. Oh, another good one would be like the First Jedi Temple. Really cool idea, but barely explored. But the last thing I want to talk about was the fact that the Clone Wars was targeted at children. Yes, it talked up to those children and had mature storylines and themes that adults can enjoy, but it was still for children. And this was key because kids were not jaded by this prequel trilogy hate. Similarly, this fictitious show should target children who aren't jaded by the sequel trilogy hate. So, there you have it. An animated show set around the sequel trilogy could help shed a nicer light on those movies. It may even go so far as to, quote, save the sequel trilogy. But the only way it could work is if it is a good show. And some things that would make it a good show would be making an anthology series, reinterpreting underutilized or poorly developed characters from the sequel trilogy, meaningfully expanding the Star Wars universe, and making a show for children and adults both to enjoy. I have ideas on how a fictitious show could do this, but I'll save that for the next video. I do want to emphasize, though, that this would be an uphill battle. It would be really, 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 really hard for a show like this to succeed. There's not a lot of interest in the sequel trilogy, and it would be hard to justify the costs and efforts put into a show like this. But I think the potential benefit of getting people interested in the sequel trilogy again may be worth it. And I, for one, would be interested in a project like this. But even if they follow my recommended suggestions that I bring up, this show would struggle to succeed. And if it had a season 1 or 2 like the first 2 seasons of Star Wars The Clone Wars, I'm not sure it would survive. In this streaming environment, shows live or die by their first couple of seasons. So yeah, I want to believe an animated show set around the sequels trilogies could work, but I know in my heart that it would be very challenging. And unless done just right, it probably would fail to save anything and just add to the heap of sequel trilogy failures. But my question for you is, what do you think? Could an animated sequel era Star Wars show effectively save the sequel trilogy? Is the trilogy too far gone to save? Has it been too long since the sequel trilogy came out for it to be saved? Let me know down in the comments below.